Milo announced his candidacy. He was the Optimates' answer to Claudius and his gangs, and during this turbulent time, Milo knew how to maneuver. Milo had eyed the consulship as far back as 57, when Pompey had given him hope. But Pompey eventually abandoned Milo by 54, and since the conference of Luca, Claudius' praise of Pompey and harsh treatment towards Milo probably strained the relationship between them even further. Milo will ask Pompey for support for his consulship, but Pompey will decline. But Milo will be supported by men like Cicero and some of the new upcoming generation of senators like Caelius and Curio. He will secure a marriage alliance with the Sulli by marrying the promiscuous daughter of the dictator Sulla, and he will gain the support of Cato the Younger. Milo's chances of winning were pretty good. Pompey will support his own candidate, Publius Plautius Hypsias. Now the Plautii were long supporters of Pompey. Plautius himself served as quaestor under Pompey in the east and was close with him. Pompey will put his full weight behind Plautius. Now the most prominent of the candidates was Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius Scipio Nasica, that's his full name. Head of the great Metellan clan, he was born a Scipio and was adopted by Metellus Pius. He also shared heritage with the Licinii Crassi, as well as the Musii Scivoli. Metellus Pius seems to have been ignorant and uninspired, and it seems that he also liked pornographic displays. His political career had been independent, and because of how powerful he was, unimpeded. He was no friend to the Catonians. He stole Aemilia Lepida from Marcus Cato, who was betrothed to him, and Marcus Avonius, also known as Cato's ape because of how he imitated Cato, tried to prosecute him in 60, but was unsuccessful. Claudius, who was running for the praetorship, could not stand the thought of Milo winning the consulship, because if he won, he would stifle Claudius's bid for the praetorship. Thus he put his full weight behind Pompey's candidate Plautius Hypsias and the other candidate Metellus Scipio. Plautius and Metellus saw the advantage of having Claudius on their side, and both worked together against Milo. Having Claudius only escalated the situation. Electioneering was met with violence and bribery. The consuls who were overseeing the elections lost control and found themselves too partaking in the violence. The consul Calvinus was wounded. Because of this, the Senate could not be summoned, and the elections were postponed beyond the end of the year. Finally, on January 18th, the gangs of Claudius and Milo clashed on the Appian Way, where Claudius was killed. As a result of his death, street riots ensued, and when they tried to cremate his body in the Senate house, the fire spread and burned it down. Raids were made on the houses of Milo and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, who was the interrex, and refused to hold the elections immediately due to procedural reasons. Rome took action. The Senate met and passed its ultimate decree, that the interrex, the tribunes, and Pompey Magnus see to it that the republic should come to no harm. Now why Pompey Magnus? Because he was a proconsul who held imperium, who was nearby the city of Rome. He could gather troops if need be to quell any riots. The burning down the Senate house sparked outrage in favor of Milo, who had men like Cicero, Cato, and Caelius defending him. However, as time went on, interrex after interrex, the Senate had lost patience and opted to cancel the elections and install a temporary authoritarian rule. This was the role of dictatorship. Many Pompeians called for Pompey to be made dictator, while others called for Caesar to be recalled to share power with Pompey. However, Cato the Younger moved in to break the stalemate. His ally Marcus Bibulus moved in and proposed that Pompey be given sole consulship instead of being made dictator, and after a period of 2 months should choose any man he wished to be his co-consul. This proposal by Bibulus was supported by Cato the Younger, and the Senate approved. By March of 52, Pompey entered his sole consulship. Now the actions of Cato might have been seen as some sort of reconciliation between Pompey and Cato. However, this is not the case. Cato did not want in any way Pompey to be made dictator, nor worse, a joint rule between Caesar and Pompey. He and the rest of the Catonians wanted to restore order within the city, and Pompey was the best man for the job due to his imperium and being near Rome. Pompey as consul will ask Cato to be his advisor, and Cato will refuse him and will continue to work against him. Pompey as consul acted swiftly. He immediately proposed 2 laws to reduce political violence and bribery. The electoral corruption and violence of the last 6 months had exceeded extraordinary bounds. Pompey introduced the Lex Pompeia Deui. Its intentions was clear and aimed at offenses committed in the immediate past. Pompey purposefully called out recent events, the death of Claudius, the burning down of the Senate house, and the riots. But Hortensius called for caution. He wanted to have the trials take place in a special court, and the Senate was divided. They called for a vote. Those in favor of allowing trials to run under normal proceedings were vetoed by 2 tribunes. Milo saw the writing on the wall. Pompey was out to convict him. Milo made one last attempt by having a friendly tribune block the proceedings. However, Pompey would move to have special courts and said that he would defend the state under force of arms if he had to. Now, the trials held under the new law came with new rules. Advocates for defense and prosecutions were reduced in number, and a time limit was placed on all speeches. Written testimony from absent advocates was banned, along with laudatory orations and character witnesses. The trials themselves were not to exceed 5 days. An ex-consul was to be immediately selected due to a clause within the bill, who would preside as officer for the court. This would be nominated by popular vote. Domitius and Ahenobarbus would be selected to preside over Milo's trial. Pompey also created the list of jurors for each case. Milo will be prosecuted under the Lex Pompeia as well as the Lex Plautia Devi. However, Milo would not be the only one to receive this fate. Now, at the same time as passing this law, Pompey also passed another one aimed for the long term. This law was the Lex Pompeia Dei Ambitu, and was specifically designed for electoral bribery. However, Pompey made the law retroactive, which meant that those who had committed crimes in the past could still be charged. Cato and many others objected to the law because it could be abused to call up some old or forgotten abuse. Milo would be charged under this new law as well as the Lex Licinia de Sodelices. On the first day of Milo's trial, supporters of Claudius created a disturbance whereby Pompey had, after that day, surrounded the court with soldiers. Now, under the Lex Pompeia, the 81 jurors who would decide the fate of Milo were not selected until the day the outcome of the trial was to be decided. This meant that it was virtually impossible to bribe the jurors. Now, how exactly this worked, I am unsure, because there were jurors before the fifth and final day, as Caesar would later complain that under the Lex Pompeia, one set of jurors heard the evidence and another delivered the verdict. It is possible that the 81 jurors that were selected were given access to the written record, but this is unverifiable. However, the most important aspect to take away from Pompey's new law is that the jurors were selected to deliver the verdict on the fifth and final day. Milo was condemned and sent into exile. He went to Massilia. Many others would be prosecuted, such as Milo's supporter Marcus Salphaeus, who led the attack against Claudius, and also the notorious minion of Claudius, Cloelius, was prosecuted by Favonius, aka Cato's ape, and was sent into exile. Now, I won't go and list all of them, but there are a few others that we have to discuss. Pompey soon found that his own friends would be prosecuted under his law. But first, at some point in 52, Pompey would marry the daughter of Metellus Scipio, Cornelia. Plutarch writes a nice description of her, to which I will read. He writes, Pompey now entered the city, and married Cornelia, a daughter of Metellus Scipio. She was not a virgin, but had lately been left a widow by Publius, the son of Crassus, whose virgin bride she had been before his death in Parthia. The young woman had many charms, apart from her youthful beauty. She was well versed in literature, in playing the lyre, and in geometry, and had been accustomed to listen to philosophical discourses with profit. In addition to this, she had a nature which was free from that unpleasant officiousness which such accomplishments are apt to impart to young women, and her father's lineage and reputation were above reproach. Now both Metellus Scipio and Pompey's candidate, Plautius Hypsias, were being prosecuted under Pompey's new ambitu law, and it looked like both were going to be condemned. Pompey couldn't allow this, but he could not save both of them. Pompey would have to choose, and Metellus Scipio had the greater pedigree. Pompey would choose Scipio, his new father-in-law, to be his co-consul, thus granting him immunity from prosecution. Hypsias, on the other hand, who was a longtime friend of Pompey and served with him in his campaigns, a man, as Plutarch says, was of consular dignity, went down to his knees and begged Pompey for help, to which Pompey replied contemptuously that he was spoiling his dinner. Plautius was sacrificed, but at a cost. Pompey was attacked for saving Scipio from prosecution and for abandoning his friend Hypsias. Many of Pompey's friends would be prosecuted under his new legislation, and Pompey had no choice but to sit by helplessly as his friends were prosecuted and condemned. He tried, however, but to no avail. Men like Cicero and Hortensius were called upon almost daily to take on one case and another. The fact of the matter is that Pompey's legislation was extremely effective. All those who participated in and contributed to the state of affairs in the past few months were brought to justice. However, once the Roman government had regained control, political divisions started to reappear, and Pompey would find himself attacked yet again. During Pompey's consulship, a law was proposed by tribunes who supported Caesar called the Law of the 10 Tribunes. This was originally proposed to recall Caesar to Rome and have him serve as Pompey's co-consul. However, Caesar still wanted to be in Gaul to gain some further conquest, so instead he convinced the tribunes to propose a new law that instead allowed Caesar to run for the consulship in absentia once his command in Gaul had ended. However, Pompey passed two laws that were to Caesar's disadvantage. One was a reform to Rome's system of provincial administration. One must now wait 5 years before taking up a command after their consulship. This was directed to reduce electoral bribery. A consular candidate would take out a loan, then once their consulship was over, step directly into their command and extort the province in order to repay the loans and make profit. Now that this was delayed for 5 years, one would think twice before taking out loans. Now this would undermine Caesar's position because after his consulship was over, should he win the consulship, he would be open to prosecution. Now Cato himself might have helped Pompey with the creation of this law. The second law Pompey passed was one that required a consular candidate to profess his candidacy in person, meaning Caesar would have to be in Rome in order to run for the consulship. Caesar no doubt took this as an attack against him by Pompey, but when questioned on the matter, Pompey responded that he did not mean to deprive Caesar of his candidacy in absentia, and after the law had already passed, he added a new clause exempting Caesar from this bill. However, legal experts like Cicero knew that this was not legally binding. The question is, did Pompey know this? Possibly. It is probable that Pompey wanted to show both Caesar and the Optimates his power to act as he pleased. And to Caesar, this was to show that he still backed him, but with a warning that Caesar relied heavily on Pompey's support, and without it, the Catonians would bring him to political ruin. Pompey at this moment was the most important man in Rome. He dedicated a temple to Victoria in commemoration for his own achievements, and his command in Spain was renewed for 5 more years. In 51 BC, Cato himself ran for the consulship with the promise of recalling and prosecuting Caesar. However, he employed no strategy and refused to pander to the public. He dished out no bribes and promised no favors. He lost, but he seemed to have wanted to win over admiration rather than votes. The consuls elected were Servius Sulpicius Rufus and Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Sulpicius Rufus was a erudite lawyer who could be relied upon to maintain constitutional standards, and Marcellus was someone completely against Caesar. He was a powerful orator with intense convictions. In 51, Marcellus will immediately try to recall and prosecute Caesar. However, Caesar's command has yet to expire, and Marcellus will receive opposition from every side, including his co-consul Sulpicius, as it violates the Lex Licinia Pompeia, the law that extended Caesar's command by an additional 5 years. Sulpicius, along with Hirtius, Caesar's secretary, called the move illegitimate and premature. Marcellus made the claim that the war in Gaul was over, and that Caesar should be forced to return to Rome, and also that Pompey's law, the Lex Licinia Pompeia, annulled the law of the 10 tribunes, that granted Caesar the right to run for the consulship in absentia. The Senate, in response, passed 4 resolutions on September 30th, 51. The first resolution being that the question of Caesar's command would not be decided until March 1st. The second, that obstructionism or vetoes against those dispositions would be adjudged in violation of public interest. The third, that the Senate would be allowed to look at the discharge claims of any of Caesar's soldiers. The fourth being to set aside 8 provinces as well as one other, Cilicia, which was currently being governed by Cicero, to be preserved for the Praetorii for 50 BC. What this meant was that only Syria, Gaul, and Spain would be up for grabs come next year, and since Spain was already governed by Pompey, it was really just Syria and Gaul. Since most of these resolutions were anti-Caesarian, they were of course vetoed, except for the discussion of provinces. Now, what was Pompey doing during this time? He was playing a difficult political game. He will of course come to Caesar's defense on March 1st, 50, but he, during this time, was trying to unite his triumvirate supporters with his newfound aristocratic associates. Now remember, Pompey wants to be the leading man in Rome, not to be dictator, but top of the aristocratic hierarchy. He did not want to abandon his ally Caesar, yet he still wanted to move closer to the Senate. His plan to create this new order or coalition, which would wipe out the Catonians and make way for his political ascendancy, but this was a game that was far beyond the ability of Pompey. He had eroded too much influence in these past years, as well as the envy and resentment that had built up amongst the aristocrats were now being directed towards Caesar. Not only this, but the Catonians and enemies of Pompey were constantly pressuring Pompey to say something or make a move that would tear his alliance with Caesar apart. but Pompey would constantly evade such tactics with constitutional posture. Now, Pompey, up until March 1st, was ambiguous about his intentions and rarely revealed his true intentions to those around him. He made the claim in a Senate debate in September that no Senate decree would be passed, but that his father-in-law Metellus Scipio would bring up the discussion of the Gallic provinces for March 1st, 50. This was taken to believe that Pompey was moving against Caesar by not allowing him to run for the consulship in absentia. I will read to you a letter written by Caelius Rufus to Cicero discussing this event. He writes, "Your friend Pompey is openly against Caesar being elected consul, while he retains his province and army. But speaking in the Senate, he himself said that no decree should be passed at present, while Scipio proposed the question of the Gallic provinces should be brought before the House on the calends of March." His speech cast a gloom over Balbus Cornelius. Cornelius Balbus was a friend of Caesar's and protested the proposal by Metellus, but Pompey here could claim that he was being fair to Caesar since his command expired by March 1st, 50. But Caesar would not be able to run for the consulship while in Gaul. But technically, he could wait outside Rome. But for Caesar, this meant that his political survival rested on Pompey's shoulders. Pompey most likely would have come to his allies' aid in any prosecution. But Pompey obviously wanted to be the top dog. In another letter written in mid-September from Caelius Rufus to Cicero, Pompey's attitude here shows exactly how he felt towards Caesar. Caelius writes, "Moreover, certain remarks of Gnaeus Pompeius have been noted, and have greatly raised public confidence. He said that before the calends of March, he could not in fairness take a decision about Caesar's provinces, but that after this date he would have no hesitation. Asked what would be the position if vetoes were cast at that point, he replied that it made no difference whether Gaius Caesar was going to disobey the Senate or was putting up someone to prevent the Senate from passing a decree. And supposing, said another questioner, he chooses to be consul and keep his army. To which Pompey, as gently as you please, and supposing my son chooses to take his stick to me." These utterances of his have produced an impression that Pompey is having trouble with Caesar. Pompey here will protect Caesar as a father would protect his son, but the most important part of this is Caesar is not an equal to Pompey in his eyes. However, the enemies of Pompey took advantage of his ambiguity. Back in the winter of 54/53, Pompey had lent Caesar one of his legions, and in July 51, Pompey was being pressured by members of the Senate to take back his legion, claiming that Caesar no longer needed that extra legion. Pompey was in a situation where if he demanded his legion from Caesar, it would strain the relationship between them, but at the same time, if he did not, his decision would be used for further attacks against him. Pompey's response was that he would withdraw his legion from Caesar's camp, but in his own time and not under hostile pressure. The consuls of 50 were Gaius Marcellus, the cousin of the previous consul Marcus Marcellus, who was going to continue the anti-Caesarian policies of his cousin, and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the son of Marcus Lepidus, who was a consul of 78, inherited a blood feud against Pompey, which would rise above all other considerations. Early in the year 50, Pompey had spent most of his time defending his son's father-in-law, Appius Claudius, in court, and then in February, Pompey had to deal with the switching sides of Curio from the Senate's camp over to Caesar's. But before that, let's look at Curio's character. Gaius Scribonius Curio was a gifted but erratic and unpredictable character. He secured election to the tribunate with a stance against Pompeians and Caesarians. Caelius called him a man who only acted on impulse. Some say he did not know his own mind. Velleius Paterculus, an historian born during the reign of Augustus, says Curio was a man of noble birth, eloquent, reckless, prodigal, alike of his own fortune and chastity, and of those of other people, a man of the utmost cleverness and perversity, who used his gifted tongue for the subversion of the state. When he won the election, Cicero congratulated him, but also gave him solemn warnings. That is why on March 1st, when the Senate convened to discuss Caesar's command, it came as a shock to Pompey when Curio proposed that both Caesar and Pompey should give up their command. This move was meant to win sympathy for Caesar and undermine Pompey. By making Pompey's Spanish command equal to Caesar's, it made Pompey go from being the arbiter of Caesar's fate to bringing him down to Caesar's level. By making it look like Caesar was happy to resign his command as long as Pompey did, it made Pompey look instead of the voice of moderation, a man who wanted sole power, that Caesar was reasonable and fair, while Pompey was power-hungry. Pompey responded with a new proposal, that Caesar should step down from his command on November 13th. This caused issues because it was believed to be the date of which Crassus set out for Parthia, although this is uncertain. However, November 13th may have just been a random date that Pompey selected. Both Curio and Caelius thought this was an attack on Caesar, but Pompey downplayed it, saying that he was being fair and that Curio was out to stir up trouble. Caelius also believed that Pompey was afraid that Caesar might secure the consulship before giving up his command and legions. This is probably true and is nothing new from how Pompey felt in the previous summer. But November 13th was a good choice. It only gave Caesar 6 weeks to wait outside Rome, which would make Pompey look good, and Caesar could say that Pompey saved him from prosecution because he could still run for the consulship in absentia, and in Pompey's eyes, this was more than fair. But Curio's proposal meant that Caesar was no longer ready to see Pompey as his superior, just as Pompey was not willing to see Caesar as an equal. And while Curio's proposal on March 1st put Pompey into a defensive situation in the short term, in the long term, it brought Caesar and Pompey that much closer to confrontation. And by the summer, the situation had become much more intense. By summer of 50, Caesar and Curio had brought civil war that much closer. Caelius predicted that if an attack was made against Curio, Caesar would come to defend him. But if Pompey and the Optimates did nothing, Caesar would stay for as long as he liked in Gaul. Pompey could not endure the Senate doing nothing, and in that regard, he too could be seen as bringing civil war closer. But it was Caesar and Curio who created the situation in the first place by forcing Pompey to make a choice he did not wish to make. Pompey was unsure of what to do next. Curio kept on repeating his proposal, adding that he was doing this to preserve the balance of power and reduce tension in the state. During the summer, the Senate decided that it was time to make war on Parthia and requested 1 legion from Pompey and Caesar. Pompey decided it was a good time to recall his legion from Caesar's camp, which meant that Caesar would lose 2 legions. Caesar complied, in effect giving 2 Gallic legions in good faith, one being from his own and the other being from Pompey. However, the legions never went east. Instead, they stayed in Italy to await further developments. Caesar would not let this go and believed that he was deceived. Then something happened to Pompey. Pompey was struck with a recurring fever that had gotten so bad his life was thought to be in danger. What it was is uncertain. It could have been malaria, but who knows? All of Italy said prayers for his recovery, and when he did indeed recover, everyone rejoiced. This gave him great confidence, and news came in that his legions were coming, as well as morale in Caesar's camp was at an all-time low. It was around this time Pompey made his famous boast. Plutarch writes, "For," said he, "in whatever part of Italy I stamp upon the ground, there will spring up armies of foot and horse." During his sickness, Pompey accepted Caesar's proposal to resign his command, but Curio countered him and said that Pompey must resign first. However, we must remember that Pompey's command doesn't expire until 47 BC. Let's look at the political arena before I end the video. The Marcelli, that is, the consul of 51, Marcus Marcellus, and the consul of this year, which is 50, Gaius Marcellus, as well as the consul for 49, Gaius Claudius Marcellus, the brother of the consul of 51, as well as a few other individuals that need not be named at the moment, were actively trying to dislodge Pompey from Caesar. Curio, on the other hand, was determined to dislodge Caesar from Pompey. His goal was so that he could build his own political base off the wreckage of the triumvirate. Should Pompey and Caesar strengthen their alliance, it would mean less room to maneuver for Curio. Now the question is, was Curio truly speaking for Caesar? The answer is not entirely. Caesar giving up both legions without objection shows us his willingness to compromise with Pompey and the Senate. And Curio's tactic to allow Caesar to remain in Gaul and run for the consulship in absentia when the time was right, he knew fully well that Pompey could not concede to the latter. But Curio deliberately pressed the issue to cause further strain between Caesar and Pompey. This maneuver, we can safely say, was out of the Claudius's playbook. The Marcelli, on the other hand, sought to call the bluff on Curio, who claimed that Caesar would come to his aid in defense of his veto. But the majority of the Senate did not want to escalate tensions. They wanted peace and compromise above all else. That is why, on December 1st, 50, the Senate voted overwhelmingly in favor of having both Caesar and Pompey lay down their commands. However, the consul Gaius Marcellus dismissed the Senate before the vote could be ratified and asked Pompey to take up the defense of Italy by taking up command of the 2 legions stationed in Capua, as well as to raise troops. By December 10th, which was the end of Curio's tribunate, he left Rome to join Caesar. This was seen as an omen. The 2 new consuls for 49 were Cornelius Lentulus Cruz, an anti-Caesarian, and, as I said before, Gaius Claudius Marcellus, the brother of the consul 51. And while Caesar had failed to secure some supporters for the consulship, he did secure some other offices, but more on that in a bit. In Cato the Younger, I said that Domitius Enobarbus made his last stand at Corfinium because he distrusted Pompey. He wanted to force Pompey to attack Caesar, that he disobeyed Pompey's orders to retreat south because of some nefarious reason. I forget exactly how I worded it, but it's something along those lines. But in actual history, that is not the case. Domitius did not disobey Pompey's orders. There was just an actual misunderstanding, and we're going to look at the evidence. And by proving that Domitius did not disobey Pompey's orders for nefarious reasons, shows that it puts Pompey in a different light, that he wasn't, that the cards were not entirely stacked against him, that his plan to abandon Italy failed because of him. As well as, there were some senators who disobeyed his orders because they didn't trust him, or just due to a character weakness in that individual. But it will put Pompey into a new perspective. So let's begin. In January of 49, Caesar crossed the Rubicon at the head of a legion. Rome was flung into civil war. In the midst of the chaos, the Senate, an institution that has existed since the founding of Rome, abandoned the city. Lucius Domitius Enobarbus, with a force almost the size of a legion, took up a defensive position at the well-known stronghold of Corfinium, a city that lies in central Italy. Domitius is often categorized among senators who disobeyed Pompey's orders on purpose, that he stayed at Corfinium to force Pompey to face Caesar, or that he disobeyed Pompey's orders because he distrusted Pompey. Did Domitius choose to stay at Corfinium because of these issues, or because, believing that the fight would be in Italy, he was acting according to Pompey's initial plan to fight Caesar in Italy? This section of the video will focus on two issues: the Optimates and Domitius' determination to recall Caesar and pushing for civil war, and Domitius making his last stand at Corfinium because Pompey did not disclose his decision to abandon Italy to Domitius. After the death in 54 of Julia, Gaius Julius Caesar's daughter, and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus' wife, and of Marcus Licinius Crassus in 53, the internal equilibrium of the first triumvirate weakened. For a few years after that, the Roman political situation caused the balance between the two surviving members of the triumvirate, Caesar and Pompey, to become difficult to maintain. The following are the main points of contentions. Number 1. In 53, Caesar, expecting an imminent rebellion in Gaul, requested a legion from Pompey. Pompey accepted Caesar's request and loaned him one of his own legions, of which Caesar was grateful. As he wrote in his commentary on the war, it was in the name of friendship and the Republic. Number 2. In 52, Pompey's command of the provinces of Spain was extended under the Lex Tribonia for 5 more years, expiring in 47. Number 3. In 52, Caesar received a special dispensation from Pompey and 10 tribunes to stand for the consulship in absentia once his command in Gaul has ended. Number 4. In July of 51, the Marcelli and the Catonians, the two most powerful clans in Rome at the time, in an attempt to weaken Caesar, brought up the question of the issue of the legion Pompey loaned Caesar. Pompey told the Senate that he would recall his legion, but at a time of his choosing. Number 5. September 29, 51, the Senate passed a decree to make the question of Caesar's provinces the day after March 1st, 50, which was the last day of Caesar's power extension as per the Lex Licinia Pompeia of 55. Domitius Ahenobarbus' name appears on the decree. Number 6. In 50, Pompey was preparing for war with Parthia, and the Senate decided to give Pompey 2 legions, one from both Caesar and Pompey. Pompey called upon the legion he loaned Caesar, and Caesar was forced to give up 2 legions. This was seen as a political maneuver to weaken Caesar in Gaul by removing 2 legions under his command. He took it as an act of treachery and believed that his former legions would be used against him. Number 7. On December 1st, 50 BC, Pompey and Caesar officially parted ways. What officially ended the first triumvirate was Pompey accepting to take up the defense of Italy, which Gaius Claudius Marcellus, cousin of Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the consul of 51, had offered him, usurping the prerogatives of the Senate and of the people. Pompey himself would later tell Cicero that Marcellus's actions was more likely to cause war rather than peace. The newly elected consuls for 49, Gaius Claudius Marcellus and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Cruz, would support the action for Italy and confirm Pompey's command of the provinces of Spain. It may be assumed that Marcus Porcius Cato did as well. Pompey personally wanted to see Caesar's power lessened or destroyed because he had been the first man in Rome for decades and felt threatened that his political ruin lay in Caesar's rise. The Marcelli and the Catonians also wanted Caesar stripped of his provinces and his command of his legions, because they viewed him as a threat to the state as well as to their own ambitions. And lastly, number 8. On December 1st, 50, the consul Claudius Marcellus asked the Senate what was to be done with Caesar's provinces, because his 5-year command, granted to him under the triumviral Lex Licinia Pompeia of 55, had technically expired on November 13th. When the Caesarian tribune Gaius Scribonius Curio continued advocating for both Caesar and Pompey to lay down their command, Marcellus divided Curio's proposal and asked the Senate separately whether they believed Caesar should lay down his command and whether Pompey should lay down his command. The Senate voted for Caesar to lay down his command, as was their prerogative of the Senate, but not for Pompey, because Pompey legally had 3 years left on his command. Curio then called for a new motion. Both Caesar and Pompey should lay down their command, with the Senate voting overwhelmingly in favor of the proposal, 370 senators in favor and 22 not in favor. Even though the Senate approved of the motion, the 22 senators would not allow the bill to pass. The consul Marcellus immediately dismissed the Senate before the vote could be ratified. At this point, Caesar's protection from political ruin lay only in the support of the newly elected tribunes of 49, Marcus Antonius and Quintus Cassius Longinus, and the goal was to keep the special dispensation he received in 52 to stand for the consulship in absentia once his command in Gaul has ended. Caesar wanted to remain in command until he was able to transition into his consulship. The problem with this, however, was that Caesar's command ended in November, but the election for the consulship would not take place until the summer of 49. This means his imperium would have to be extended for months, while at the same time running for the election to the consulship. If he were to become consul effectively from January 1st to December 31st, 48, Caesar and Pompey would both have their powers expire by January 1st, 47. Pompey's command in Spain would come to an end, and Caesar would have a 5-year hiatus before being able to take up another command as proconsul, making him vulnerable to prosecution. So on January 1st, 49, the Senate convened, according to protocol, to inaugurate the newly elected magistrates. The consul Gaius Claudius Marcellus and Lucius Cornelius Lentulus Cruz, fervent anti-Caesarians, and among the college of tribunes, Marcus Antonius and Quintus Cassius Longinus, Caesar's supporters. A letter from Caesar arrived, carried by Curio, who had joined Caesar in Gaul once his tribunate had expired on December 10th, 50. According to Caesar's instructions, Curio withheld the letter until the tribunes of the people were present. This was to make sure that the tribunician power would protect Curio in the Senate before presenting the letter. The tribunes, with difficulty, read the letter aloud to the Senate, but the consuls would permit no discussion of it. So let's look at who was in Rome and in the Senate at the reading of the letter. Caesar was not in Rome, but from Transalpine Gaul had moved to the city of Ravenna in Cisalpine Gaul, a province under his command just outside of Italy, with 1 legion. Caesar's move to Ravenna with only 1 legion responded to 2 contingency plans. 1, either a civil war might occur, or 2, Caesar might receive his second consulship, in which case he would use his legion for help in the voting polls. If civil war were to occur, Caesar would descend upon Italy as quickly as possible to prevent Pompey from being able to put up an effective resistance. However, should Caesar receive the right to run for a second consulship while keeping his imperium, which meant keeping his army and provinces, he would put his legion on furlough to bring them into Rome to vote for him like they had done for Crassus and Pompey in their run for the consulship in 55. Pompey already believed that Caesar's second consulship meant Pompey's own political destruction. Pompey himself could not be in Rome. He held imperium from accepting the command of the defense of Italy by the consul 50 Marcellus. He was in the area around Rome, where he met Marcus Tullius Cicero on the Via Appia near Lavernium, just south of Rome. Pompey was throwing in his support to secure those who would further his interest. He commanded 2 legions in Italy, both of which were nominally under Caesar's command. Cicero was in Italy, but not in Rome. He had arrived at Brundisium on the 24th of November, returning from his governorship of Cilicia, a Roman province in southern Asia Minor, and on December 27th he was in Formiae, a city south of Rome, probably at his villa. It is in that vicinity that Cicero met Pompey, trying to convince him to reconcile with Caesar. Cicero believed that as long as Caesar got his second consulship, civil war could be averted. But Cicero confesses that Pompey had not even the desire for peace. The tribunes Mark Antony and Cassius Longinus were in Rome on January 1st. They had been elected to the tribunate with the support of Caesar, who used his wealth obtained from Gaul and his influence to win votes. With their power of veto, they could stop any action by another magistrate in any decree of the Senate. This is why Caesar spared no effort in getting them elected. The new consuls, as I've already mentioned, Claudius Marcellus and Cornelius Lentulus Cruz, well-known opponents of Caesar, were in Rome, with Pompey's support and the support of the Marcelli and Catonians. They won their elections with the intention of recalling Caesar. They were ready to make the question of Caesar's provinces and command in the hopes of recalling him and overseeing his political destruction. The Senate in 49 comprised of around 400 men. The Senate's position, however, was no different on January 1st from what had been decided on December 1st, 50, with the majority siding to recall the power of both Caesar and Pompey to avoid civil war. But the Optimates, or anti-Caesarians, were bent on recalling Caesar, and with the newly elected consuls who supported Pompeian interests, the Optimates clung to Pompey's power as a means of maintaining the traditional institutions of the Senate. The Senate's agenda was only concerned with what was to be done with Caesar's command. Domitius had promised to bring Caesar to justice upon winning the consulship in 55, but having lost the election in 55, tried again in 54. When he had successfully won this consulship, he failed to bring Caesar to justice. Marcus Cato had run for the consulship for 52 on the promise of recalling Caesar. Marcus Claudius Marcellus, who won the consulship in 51, was also determined to bring Caesar to justice. And his cousin Gaius Claudius Marcellus also won the consulship for 50 and was determined in pursuing his cousin's policies. The text of the letter itself has not survived, but we can piece together the sources, and the discordant references to it contained either in contemporary or later sources makes its content very difficult, if not impossible, to determine. Caesar himself only tells us that, and I quote, "When Caesar's dispatch had been handed to the consuls, the tribunes, with difficulty and after much wrangling, gained their permission for it to be read in the Senate, but they could not obtain consent for a motion to be brought before the Senate on the subject of the dispatch." In a supplement to Caesar's civil war, Dionysius Vossius wrote that Caesar, after briefly enumerating his exploits and services, requested that the Senate not deprive him of the benefit of the people's favor, who had permitted him to sue for the consulship in his absence. Cicero, who was not present at the meeting, wrote on January 4th that the letter was a threatening one, and that Caesar persisted in his insistence on holding on to his legions and provinces. Vossius composed a similar, more neutral take on the letter when he wrote, but could by no means resolve, so long as he continued in command and authority, to divest himself of troops and lay himself open to the injuries of his enemies. This corroborates with Cicero's claim that Caesar's insistence of holding on to his legions and provinces. Cicero was a well-connected senator, and had either received a copy of the letter or was told the contents of the letter by a fellow senator who was present at the meeting. While the threat Cicero is referring to is unknown, it is possible that he is implying a similar statement in Appian, that Caesar is threatening war should Pompey refuse to dismiss his legions. However, other later primary sources have a much different view. Cassius Dio wrote, he promised to disband his legions and give up his office if Pompey would also do the same. For while the latter bore arms, it was not right, he claimed, that he should be compelled to give up his, and so be exposed to his enemies. This seems to complement what Appian says, as Caesar seems to be trying to compromise with the Senate. Plutarch wrote that the letter changed the minds of many, who thought from the letter that Caesar was asking for just and moderate things. This may have been some of the 22 hardliners who voted against Caesar on December 1st. Were that the case, this suggests that the consuls prevented discussion because they believed it would lead to compromise with Caesar. If what Plutarch wrote is accurate, then the letter may have also likely contained further offers of peace. Dio and Plutarch's perspective differs from that of Cicero's because they may have had a wider range of sources available to them on the contents of Caesar's letter. What all of this suggests is that Caesar's letter was not threatening the entirety of the Senate. He maintained that he had the right to run for the consulship in absentia, that he should keep his command. He was willing to give up most of his provinces and legions as long as Pompey gave up his command of Italy. And if Pompey was unwilling to step down in Italy, Caesar was willing to go to war. The tribunes read Caesar's letter, but the consuls permitted no discussion of it and raised the question of what was to be done with Caesar's command. The discussion of the letter would threaten to undo all the consuls and the Optimates' effort at forcing Caesar to return home as a private citizen and to be prosecuted. The sentiment of the rest of the Senate was still the same as it had been a month earlier when 370 senators voted for compromise. They showed considerable hesitation to make any drastic moves that might resort to civil war. The senator Marcus Callidius suggested that Pompey should leave Italy and take up his command in Spain. Senator Marcus Rufus nearly agreed with Callidius, but they were all severely reprimanded by the consul Lentulus, who expressly refused to put Callidius's motion to the vote. Caesar's use of the word all is interesting because he seems to mean that there were more senators who were of the opinion that Pompey should leave for Spain. This is probably what Plutarch meant when he wrote that the letter changed the minds of many. Cicero would write years later that he too urged Pompey to leave for Spain. Cicero does not say when he gave his advice, but January 49 before the war broke is a plausible date. This suggests that Callidius, perhaps on behalf of Caesar, had requested a motion for Pompey to abandon his Italian command. Would the 370 senators who voted in favor of Caesar and 50 vote in favor of Pompey abandoning his Italian command now? While there is no evidence, the Senate had voted in 50 against Pompey giving up his command in Spain because his term had yet to expire. So they may have been in favor of Pompey abandoning Italy because he did not receive the Senate's approval. The consuls blocked any discussion on the motion and attacked Callidius and those like him for wanting to compromise with Caesar, and threatened the Senate that Pompey will abandon them in Italy, leaving them to Caesar's mercy should they not side against Caesar. This was under the pretext that the Senate, on account of countless false rumors circulating in Rome, believed that Caesar was going to invade Italy. Once the Senate was sufficiently threatened for not taking a harder stance against Caesar, they approved the motion by Metellus Scipio that Caesar lay down his command and disband his armies before a fixed date or else be declared a public enemy of Rome. There was no evidence on when the date was set. Mark Antony and Cassius immediately vetoed the proposal by Metellus Scipio, effectively blocking the motion. Events moved forward quickly. According to Caesar, Pompey summoned the senators on the night of January 1st, outside of Rome. Troops that once belonged to Caesar in Gaul were now taking orders from Pompey, and they filled the area around and in Rome, which enhanced the pressure on the moderate senators. Pompey praised the senators who supported him, while intimidating those who were still reluctant to side against Caesar. Caesar's father-in-law, the censor Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was the consul in the year 58, and praetor Lucius Roscius, offered to go to Caesar to try and negotiate some sort of agreement. This suggests that there have been more senators willing to reach a compromise in line with the motion of Senators Callidius and Rufus because they still believed civil war could be averted. However, they were shouted down by the consul Lentulus, Pompey's father-in-law Metellus Scipio, and Marcus Porcius Cato, who had been leading the opposition against Caesar for over a decade. According to Caesar, Lentulus was deep in debt and fueled by ambition to become powerful, and says the same for Metellus Scipio, but for Cato, Caesar claims that Cato was fueled by an old personal feud. Caesar responded to the rebuff by the Senate with a new proposal sometime between January 4th and 7th. Caesar had prepared contingencies. Should the first proposal fail, he most likely instructed Curio around the same time he handed him the first letter to present an alternative plan, should the first one fail. Caesar was willing to lay down Transalpine Gaul and all but 2 legions until he could transition into his second consulship. When Pompey did not like what he was hearing, Caesar's third proposed option was to change the proposal to lay down Transalpine Gaul and Cisalpine and keep only Illyricum along with 1 legion. Since Caesar was in Ravenna, the tribunes could not communicate with him in time. The tribunes were most likely told ahead of time to haggle with the Optimates, should the second plan fail, so long as Caesar maintained a province and 1 legion. Pompey was willing to accept, since it made him all the more powerful, because he already had many legions from his command in Spain. But he was attacked by the consul Lentulus and Cato for considering the proposal, and so the offer was rejected. The relationship between Pompey and the Optimates was not like one within a political party as we are familiar with today. Their relationship depended upon mutual cooperation, and much like political alliances during the late Roman Republic, which shifted all the time, their accord could fracture and fragment much more quickly because the government of the late Roman Republic was structured in such a way to allow aristocrats to indulge in such divisions without fear of upsetting the structure. Caesar's proposal interested Pompey, who, had he accepted, since as stated above, would have made him all the more powerful than Caesar, but Pompey, in turn, would have lost the influence and support of the Optimates, which he eventually concluded was not in his best interests. It should be noted that Appian claims that it was the consuls who rebuked Pompey, and Caesar who added Metellus Scipio alongside Lentulus and Cato. Metellus Scipio was Pompey's father-in-law, Caesar's opponent, and was active in swaying the Senate in taking a stance against Caesar. This suggests that there were more senators a part of the 22 hardliners who attacked Pompey, and that they were aware that their relationship with Pompey could fracture if he were to negotiate with Caesar. On January 7th, another meeting of the Senate took place, and the majority of the Senate was willing to pass a Senatus Consultum Ultimum, authorizing the consuls, the praetors, the tribunes, and the proconsuls near Rome to take the necessary steps to defend the state. Why the Senate was now willing to pass this decree is not certain, but the pressure and the threats set upon them by the Marcelli, Cato's allies, and Pompey, with his forces throughout the city, who were pushing for war, which could certainly be the reason. Cato himself, who only wanted to push Caesar into surrendering his command, was the exception. Eventually, the Senate was convinced that war was inevitable. The tribunes, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, vetoed the decree, but their veto was ignored. Some sources claim that the tribunes were threatened with violence and were driven away to prevent any obstruction of the decree. Dio wrote that Lentulus advised them to get out of the way before the vote should be taken. And what Dio writes is most definitely a threat. Whatever that threat may have been, what the Senatus Consultum Ultimum had done was give the Senate's approval on the action of the previous consul Marcellus a year earlier, who gave Pompey the command to take up the defense of Italy against Caesar. Pompey was already in the suburbs of Rome preparing it. This preparation, in turn, gave Caesar the justification he needed to invade Italy. It is on the same meeting, on January 7th, that Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was given the command of Transalpine Gaul, de facto becoming Caesar's successor, and therefore direct rival, in the province. Domitius had for over a decade sided against the triumvirate. He was a staunch aristocrat and was against one man holding too much power. His activities against the triumvirs began as early as 61, when rumors circulated that the consul, Marcus Pupius Piso, who was helping Pompey get his legate Lucius Afranius elected consul for 60, organized agents in his home to distribute bribes to voters. Cato and Domitius passed two proposals, which regulated these agents in an attempt to block Pompey's efforts. This is the first and not the last mention of Cato and Domitius working together. Their efforts in fighting Pompey and soon Caesar will last all throughout the 50s. In 58, Domitius, as praetor, had attacked Caesar in trying to make his consular legislations invalid due to the violence employed and the neglect of the obnuntiatio declared by Caesar's co-consul, Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus. However, the triumvirs were simply too powerful and influential, and Domitius and his fellow senators could simply achieve nothing. In the consular elections of 56, 455, Cato and Domitius tried their best to prevent Pompey and Crassus from being elected. Domitius ran for the consulship himself, and his campaign slogan was an attack against the triumvirate by promising to bring Caesar to justice upon winning the consulship in 55. Caesar's proconsular command in Gaul, under the Lex Lavitinia, was expiring in 55, and Domitius was determined to call the power of the triumvirate and recall Caesar with the intention of replacing him in Gaul. Domitius' ambition to replace Caesar as proconsul of Transalpine Gaul was rooted in his familial ties with the region. Domitius' ancestor, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, the consul of the year 122 BC, had taken part in the conquest and organization of Gaul, and it was for this that Domitius asserted an hereditary claim. His family name was embedded in Gaul, and so would, in alignment with Roman tradition, have been given patrician privilege over it. Domitius was determined to win the election in 55, but the triumvirate had used their supporters to block him and Cato from entering the forum on election day, and so political violence ensued between Domitius, Cato, and the supporters of the triumvirate, in an attempt to get into the forum, but to no avail. In 54, Domitius won the consulship, and Cato won the praetorship, and both were determined to go after the triumvirate. However, Domitius failed to bring Caesar to justice. After Pompey became sole consul of 52, Domitius sat as juror at the trial of Milo, and Cato sat as juror as well. In August of 51, Domitius ran for the augurate. The augurate was a priestly college that offered very little power, but gave prestige and influence, which he was expected to win because of his vast family connections, but lost to Mark Antony, a supporter of Caesar. On September 29, 51, Domitius' name appeared on the decree to make the question of Caesar's provinces the day after March 1st, 50. It can be assumed that he was also in Rome on March 1st, 50, an important date for the Marcelli and Catonians because it gave them another attempt to recall Caesar. His name is not mentioned as being present during the voting on December 1st, 50, when Pompey received the command for the defense of Italy, and when the question of Caesar's imperium, which had expired on November 13th or around there, was discussed. But given his previous actions against the triumvirate and against Caesar himself, his presence in the Senate is highly plausible. He would have been against the Senate trying to reach for a compromise, so that Caesar's command would come to an end as soon as possible. Domitius was most likely in Rome on January 1st, when Caesar's letter was presented to the Senate. Neither he nor Cato are mentioned as being part of the Senate meeting, but considering that Cato was at Pompey's Senate gathering that night, Cato could rely upon the help of Domitius when it came to dealing with the triumvirate. It is safe to say that Domitius, and probably Cato as well, were in fact in Rome and at the Senate meeting on January 1st. Since Cato was at the Senate meeting between January 4th and 7th, there is no doubt that he would have called upon Domitius to support. Domitius must have been at the last Senate meeting when he received the imperium for Transalpine Gaul. When he took the field with 4,000 of Pompey's men, it was done so most likely under Pompey's orders. Domitius had therefore many reasons to go to war with Caesar. Caesar was a threat to his political and military ambitions. Domitius, the Catonians, and the Marcelli all viewed the triumvirate and Caesar as their enemy. They made numerous attempts at recalling Caesar over the past decade. Their attempts at circumventing the Lex Licinia Pompeia, which extended Caesar's command for 5 years, had failed. Marcus Marcellus had made it clear that Caesar should be recalled as soon as his term expired, which was on March 1st, 50, and this was Domitius and his allies' mindset. While Domitius and the Marcelli and the Catonians were eager for war, they could not do so without the backing of Pompey, a member of the triumvirate against which they fought for decades. Domitius and his fellow Optimates naturally distrusted Pompey because he had walked a thin line between Caesar and the Optimates for some time. Pompey had allowed Caesar up until this point to extend his Gallic command, but could not revert his stance without losing dignitas. Pompey's power came from his vast clientele and his legions, which he acquired during his conquest in the East, the reorganization of the eastern provinces, and his governorship of Spain. Both his military experience and his vast clientele allowed him to recruit vast amounts of people on repayment of political debts and obligations. For Pompey, the Marcelli and the Catonians, with their aristocratic connections and influence, were a tool which Pompey could use to bolster his political support. Without political support, Pompey would be isolated, but without his legions, the Optimates would have no teeth to bite Caesar. Despite the Marcelli and the Catonians' venomous stance against the triumvirate, their alliance with Pompey was nothing but part of the traditional pattern of Roman politics. Domitius had to find his place in this environment. He was a proconsul with his own imperium, but Pompey remained the leader of the Optimates. However, it can be disputed whether Domitius had to follow Pompey's orders because technically they were equal in rank. However, the Ahenobarbii was an old family compared to the gens Pompeia from Picenum. Their relationship was probably based on mutual cooperation. Domitius is the only Optimate who took the field with a force that large. Soon after the Senatus Consultum Ultimum of January 7th, the problems of not knowing when Domitius took the field and the relation of that with the date of Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon presents an issue for today's historian. Caesar crossed the Rubicon on January 10th or 11th, but the news did not reach Rome until January 17th. A few factors must be considered. For instance, Cicero wrote on January 12th that at the time Pompey was already taking steps for the defense of Italy, therefore before he knew of Caesar's crossing. So did Domitius take the field on January 12th as well, or some days before or after? It is possible that Domitius took the field around that date, and he was most likely in the suburbs around Rome. In fact, he might have been assigned to the Marsi territory, east of Rome and south of Picenum, by Pompey Magnus. The SC Ultimum gave the Optimates supreme imperium, power equal to that of Pompey, but Pompey was still the overall decision-maker due to his past military experience and influence. On January 12th, Cicero wrote that he was assigned Capua by Pompey to start recruiting for the defense of Italy. The consuls remained in Rome, but were assigned to Capua to recruit men when the war broke out. This implies that around January 12th, Pompey was coordinating with the Senate in assigning territory to those with Imperium. Appian says that Domitius took the field immediately upon being named successor of Transalpine Gaul, and if what Cicero writes is true, then it is safe to assume that around January 12th, Domitius took the field. Since the SC Ultimum had assigned Transalpine Gaul to Domitius, the expectation would be that Domitius would leave and try to reach that province. The ways for him to do that were either the Via Aurelia along the Tyrrhenian coast, or the Via Flaminia, which would have allowed him to encroach directly with Caesar in Cisalpine Gaul. However, Domitius decided to go to Corfinium, east of Rome, in the territory of the Marsi. Why? Did Pompey assign that territory to him through some sort of mutual coordination, or did Domitius act on his own initiative? When the news of Caesar crossing the Rubicon reached Rome, it forced Pompey and the Optimates to retreat into southern Italy. Even though military command was equally shared amongst the men with Imperium, Pompey was clearly the leading strategist. And while Pompey and the Optimates were trying to get their bearings straight, having just left Teanum on the 23rd en route to Larinum in the region of Apulia, Corfinium provided a strong defensive position for Domitius and the Republican cause. It lay almost in the center of Italy, east of Rome along the Via Valeria. It was a known strategic stronghold that had been used in previous wars, one being the Social War of 90 BC. Its position would prevent Caesar from marching on Pompey near Lucaria without first having to gauge Domitius's forces. That is why Domitius wrote to Pompey around February 10th, informing him that he will watch Caesar from Corfinium to see where he goes, and that he will join Pompey at Samnium should Caesar move along the coast. Samnium is a region of south-central Italy, and Lucaria, where Pompey is headquartered, is in the region of Apulia, east of Samnium. Why would Domitius leave for Samnium if he knew that Pompey was abandoning Italy? In the letters written by Pompey to Domitius from February 11th to the 17th, ordering him to march south to his headquarters in Lucaria, a distance of about 140 miles, it is clear that Pompey never disclosed his intentions of abandoning Italy to Domitius. On January 28th, Pompey tells Cicero that he would have a force strong enough to engage Caesar in Picenum. On February 2nd and 13th, Cicero wrote as if the plan was to fight in Italy. For the consuls, Pompey tells them to join him at Apulia and to leave a garrison at Capua. Why would Pompey tell the consuls to leave a garrison at Capua if his intentions were to abandon Italy? Cicero was also under the impression that the consuls were going to Apulia to fight in Italy. On February 27th, Cicero communicated to Pompey that he did not know that Pompey's plan was to abandon Italy. The first letter in which Pompey made his intentions to abandon Italy clear is his letter to the consuls dated February 18th after Domitius had been defeated at Corfinium. Pompey also told the consuls to take their garrisons with them to Brundisium. So, Domitius, who was in the dark as to Pompey's plans, was left trying to coordinate with Pompey for the defense of Italy. Because he believed that that was still the overall strategy, he stayed at Corfinium because it was a strong strategic defensive position, he was unaware of Pompey's new plans, and he still believed that the fight would take place in Italy. On January 10th or 11th, shortly after the passing of the ultimate decree, Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Caesar tells us why, and I quote, "Thereupon the men of the 13th legion, which was present, he had called this out at the beginning of the disorder, the rest had not yet come together, exclaim that they are ready to repel the wrongs of their commander and of the tribunes. I have always reckoned the dignity of the republic of first importance and preferable to life. I was indignant that a benefit conferred on me by the Roman people was being insolently wrested from me by my enemies, and that, robbed of my 6 months' command, I was being dragged back to the city when the people had directed that I should be allowed to be a candidate in absence at the next election. Nevertheless, for the sake of the state, I have borne with equanimity this infringement of my prerogative." Caesar claims 2 reasons as to why he crossed the Rubicon at the head of a legion. It was a matter of personal dignitas, and that he still had 6 months left in his command. Caesar's claim that he still had 6 months left for his command must be foregone because there was no indication in any of the sources of a fixed date to his command, and that it was the prerogative of the Senate to decide when his term came to an end after his 5-year extension had expired, which happened in the year 50. Caesar had no reason to fear any sort of political prosecution from the Optimates, because he had used his wealth and influence in the past to get his supporters, men of lesser political importance, acquitted during trials. He could afford to stand for the consulship as a private citizen. Even Pompey and Cicero believed Caesar would have no trouble winning his second consulship. The true issue lied between Caesar and Pompey, more specifically, Pompey's army. Caesar would not return to Rome until Pompey disbanded his legions. Caesar had mentioned several times until the crossing of the Rubicon the treachery imposed on him by the dispatching of his 2 legions, one of which belonged to Pompey, as discussed earlier. Dignitas was Rome's greatest prestige. It lied within the moral code structure of the mos maiorum, which means way of the ancestors, and Caesar would not give that up. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Cicero wrote, and he said he's doing this all himself because of his dignitas. From all the Senate meetings from January 1st to the 7th, Caesar had been actively trying to get Pompey to dismiss his legions because Caesar riding through the countryside and into Rome full of his former legionnaires who were mustering against him by Pompey was a humiliation Caesar was unwilling to bear. Because dignitas is the highest value in Roman society, this was a good reason, as far as Caesar was concerned, to list it as a reason to why he crossed the Rubicon. While Caesar had no reason to fear any prosecution from the Optimates on account of his wealth and influence, his trial would end up like that of the trial of Milo, in a court surrounded by Pompey's soldiers. Whether he would be condemned or not, this would be an attack on his dignitas. The news of Caesar's crossing came as a blow to Pompey and the Optimates. The news reached Rome on January 17th, a week after Caesar crossed the Rubicon, and Pompey was not ready to face Caesar. Even though he had 2 legions, he doubted their disposition because of their previous employment under Caesar, and with new recruits, he couldn't risk a decisive engagement. Pompey could also not get a grip on Caesar's whereabouts, and so he decided to have the Senate abandon Rome on the same day. Caesar himself was in Ariminum on the 14th at the latest, and had already taken Pisaurum, Fanum, and Ancona, a distance of about 66 miles from Ariminum, before the news reached Pompey. As chaos ensued in Italy, Cicero was on the fence with whom he should support. Although eventually siding with Pompey, he thought that both Caesar and Pompey would be another Sulla. He was highly critical of Pompey's decision to abandon Italy. He also thought that the more distinguished aristocrats like Metellus Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, would use proscriptions and confiscations as a means to regain their lost fortunes. And Pompey and the leading senators were threatening Italian cities and towns, telling them not to side with Caesar. Now, if we look at it from Pompey's perspective, he was probably feeling depressed. Abandoning Rome came as a huge psychological blow to the morale of the leading senators who blamed Pompey. Pompey also felt betrayed in that he had lost the initiative. Remember, he wanted nothing more than to be loved and the leading man of Rome, so his vanity also played a role when he did not receive the immediate and enthusiastic support of Italy or the nearby towns. What also weighed on his mind was that he knew that he was merely a weapon being used by his fellow senators, that even if he defeated Caesar, he would be disposed of once he was of no further use. But did Pompey truly intend to be another Sulla? It's hard to say. I would say from a mere survivalist standpoint, Pompey would have sought the dictatorship. Now soon all of Italy will refuse to take up arms against Caesar. They, like the majority of the Senate, wanted peace, And now with Domitius' forces defeated by Caesar, Pompey withdrew his army from Brundisium, crossing the Adriatic Sea to Greece and camping near Dyrrachium. His strategy: take control of the sea and the grain supplies. Then when Caesar is weakened, invade Italy. Caesar, not having enough ships to cross the Adriatic, went west to take Spain from Pompey. Both Curio and Caelius believed that the fall of Spain meant the end of Pompey. However, Cicero knew that the war would not end with the taking of Spain. In fact, Pompey had never been interested in holding on to Spain, and most likely saw this as buying time to prepare for the inevitable conflict with Caesar. It was at this time Pompey put his vast connections to the east to good use. He was now declared supreme commander of the Republican forces on the motion of the consul Lentulus Cruz. He assembled ships from Greece, the provinces of Asia, and Egypt, with orders that more were to be built. He also amassed auxiliaries from the east. Money was collected from the wealthy provinces of Asia, Syria, and Greece. Pompey also collected all available grain from Thessaly, Asia, Egypt, Crete, Cyrene, and all areas under his control. He placed Cato in charge of holding Sicily, but Cato would abandon Sicily without a fight to avoid bloodshed. It should be noted that once Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Cato was pursuing peace all throughout the war. Bibulus, Caesar's co-consul in 59, was placed in command of the fleet. Caesar broke through the blockade and crossed into Greece. He had sent an envoy to Pompey pursuing peace, but Pompey could not accept without being made to look like Caesar's lesser, so he refused, which Caesar knew would happen. In March of 48, Pompey failed to prevent Mark Antony from bringing reinforcements to Caesar, who was besieging Pompey at Dyrrachium. However, Pompey broke the siege, and now he was faced again with the future conduct of the war. Although he was supreme commander, he was under considerable pressure by the other commanders. He could invade Italy. This was suggested by his old and loyal friend Afranius. Other options were a decisive battle in Greece, or avoiding one in the hopes of wearing Caesar down. Pompey's immediate concern was that of public opinion, and was hesitant to leave Metellus Scipio behind to face Caesar, if he were to invade Italy. Pompey's own inclination on what to do was to wear Caesar down and attack him when he was weak enough. But none of the main aristocrats would hear this, and accused him of wanting to prolong the war for his own personal benefit. They wanted Caesar's head as quickly as possible. Cicero tried to persuade Pompey to make peace with Caesar, and if that failed, to prolong the war. But with the victory at Dyrrachium, his judgment failed. As Cicero would say, after that victory, he was no commander. The victory brought what Pompey needed most: confidence in his troops. His officers nicknamed him Agamemnon and King of Kings. However, the victory also brought a false confidence among the Pompeian leaders. Men like Domitius, Scipio, and Spinther would argue amongst each other on who would take Caesar's office as Pontifex Maximus. Pompey would eventually decide, against his better judgment, to seek a decisive engagement with Caesar. And on the plains of Pharsalia, in August heat, began the confrontation between Caesar and Pompey. Pompey trusted his superior cavalry. However, we don't have the exact details of the battle, but it looks like inferior troops rather than inferior tactics was the reason for Pompey's defeat. Caesar had battle-hardened veterans at his side, and while Pompey had some veterans as well, he also had a large number of recruits. Mass rout ensued. Pompey broke and ran for his life. There was no doubt that he was unnerved by this defeat, and there was no sign that Pompey had even thought about the immediate future. He told the citizens of Greece to throw themselves at Caesar's mercy and took a boat to Mytilene, eventually sailing to Cilicia. Now, even though Pompey had lost at Pharsalia, he was by no means out of the picture. He still had command of the sea. In Cilicia, he rallied those he could and held a war council. After discussing the possibilities of receiving aid from Numidia, Parthia, or Egypt, it was eventually decided that he would go to Egypt, where Ptolemy owed him a kingdom. Pompey set sail to Cyprus, where he sent a letter to the young King Ptolemy, who asked on behalf of his friendship with his father for admission into Alexandria and protection. But Ptolemy's advisors, Achillas, Pothinus, and Theodotus, saw every reason to reject Pompey. They were afraid that Pompey, should he recover, would seize Egypt, culling their own power, or if he failed, bring Egypt down with him. They replied to Pompey telling him to come meet with the king, while at the same time preparing for his assassination. The task was entrusted to a Roman, Lucius Septimius, who served with Pompey during his pirate command and was left in Egypt under Gabinius after the restoration of Aetas. But I think I'm going to leave the ending of Pompey to Plutarch, who writes a nice ending for him. Just remember that he romanticizes his death just like he does Cato the Younger and many others. So he took with him a certain Septimius, who had once been a tribune of Pompey's, and Salvius besides, a centurion, with 3 or 4 servants, and put out towards the ship of Pompey. Now all the most distinguished of Pompey's fellow voyagers had come aboard of her to see what was going on. Accordingly, when they saw a reception that was not royal, nor splendid, nor in accordance with the hopes of Theophanes, but a few men sailing up in a single fishing boat, they viewed this lack of respect with suspicion, and advised Pompey to have his ship rowed back into the open sea, while they were beyond reach of missiles. But meanwhile the boat drew near, and first Septimius rose up and addressed Pompey in the Roman tongue as Imperator. Then Achilles saluted him in Greek, and invited him to come aboard the boat, telling him that the shallows were extensive, and that the sea, which had a sandy bottom, was not deep enough to float a trireme. At the same time, some of the royal ships were seen to be taking their crews aboard, and men-at-arms were occupying the shore, so that there seemed to be no escape even if they changed their minds. And besides, this very lack of confidence might give the murderers an excuse for their crime. Accordingly, after embracing Cornelia, who was bewailing his approaching death, he ordered 2 centurions to go into the boat before him, besides Philip, one of his freedmen, and a servant named Scythes. And while Achilles was already stretching out his hand to him from the boat, turned towards his wife and son and repeated the verse of Sophocles: "Whatever man upon a tyrant takes his way, his slave he is, even though a freeman when he goes." After these last words to his friends, he went into the boat, and since it was a long distance from the trireme to the land, and none of his companions in the boat had any friendly word for him, turning his eyes upon Septimius, he said, "Surely I am not mistaken, and you are an old comrade of mine." Septimius nodded merely, without saying anything to him or showing any friendliness. So then, as there was profound silence again, Pompey took a little roll containing a speech written by him in Greek, which he had prepared for his use in addressing Ptolemy, and began to read in it. Then, as they drew near the shore, Cornelia, together with his friends, stood on the trireme watching with great anxiety for the outcome, and began to take heart, when she saw many of the king's people assembling at the landing, as if to give him an honorable welcome. But at this point, while Pompey was clasping the hands of Philip that he might rise to his feet more easily, Septimius, from behind, ran him through the body with his sword, then Salvius next, and then Achilles, drew their daggers and stabbed him. And Pompey, drawing his toga down over his face with both hands, without an act or a word that was unworthy of himself, but with a groan merely, submitted to their blows, being 60 years of age less one, and ending his life only 1 day after his birthday. When the people on the ships beheld the murder, they uttered a wailing cry that could be heard as far as the shore, and weighing anchor quickly, took to flight, and a strong wind came to their aid as they ran out to sea, so that the Egyptians, though desirous of pursuing, turned back. But they cut off Pompey's head and threw the rest of his body unclothed out of the boat, and left it for those who craved so pitiful a sight. Philip, however, stayed by the body until such had taken their fill of gazing. Then he washed it in sea water, wrapped it in a tunic of his own, and since he had no other supply, sought along the coast until he found the remnants of a small fishing boat, old stuff indeed, but sufficient to furnish a funeral pyre that would answer for an unclothed corpse, and that too not entire. As he was gathering the wood and building the pyre, there came up a Roman who was now an old man, but who in his youth had served his first campaigns with Pompey, and said, "Who art thou, my man, that thinkest to give a burial rites to Pompey the Great?" And when Philip said that he was his freedman, the man said, "But thou shalt not have this honor all to thyself. Let me too share in a pious privilege thus offered, that I may not altogether regret my sojourn in a foreign land. If in requital for many hardships I find this happiness at least, to touch with my hands and array for burial the greatest of Roman imperators." Such were the obsequies of Pompey, and on the following day Lucius Lentulus, as he came sailing from Cyprus and coasted along the shore not knowing what had happened, saw a funeral pyre and Philip standing beside it, and before he had been seen himself exclaimed, "Who, pray, rest here at the end of his allotted days?" Then after a slight pause and with a groan he said, "But perhaps it is thou, Pompey the Great," and after a little he went ashore, was seized and put to death. This was the end of Pompey, but not long afterwards Caesar came to Egypt, and found it filled with this great deed of abomination. From the man who brought him Pompey's head he turned away with loathing, as from an assassin, and on receiving Pompey's seal ring he burst into tears. The device was a lion holding a sword in his paws. But Achilles and Pothinus he put to death. The king himself, moreover, was defeated in battle along the river, and disappeared.
You are enemies.
He was a consul of Rome! A consul of Rome.
Theodotus the sophist, however, escaped the vengeance of Caesar, for he fled out of Egypt, and wandered about in wretchedness and hated of all men. But Marcus Brutus, after he had slain Caesar and come into power, discovered him in Asia and put him to death with every possible torture. The remains of Pompey were taken to Cornelia, who gave them burial at his Alban villa.